Hi there. It must have been interesting to, well, not interesting, well, perhaps interesting, well, perhaps inspiring to be one of the Cathar laity in the 12th century, either northern Italy or southern France. Uh, there was the laity of the Cathars, and then there was the clergy, were called the Perfected Ones, which I suppose were a bit like the Hindu sannyasin or holy men, but there was also women as well. And the inspiration that this clergy, the perfected ones, must have had on the laity is what I find interesting. I mean, putting all theology and dualism aside, and looking at the psychology of that particular religious movement between the 12th and 14th century in Europe. When you think of the average life of a peasant, going even up to the aristocracy, really, because I suppose if you were aristocracy, you had a bit more to eat. That was about it, really, which meant that you wouldn't succumb to disease quite so quickly as the peasants. But and maybe the life of the peasant, was simpler than nowadays, but it was pretty pretty daunting as well. I mean, you had leprosy, you had plague, you had all the diseases that children get, for which there was nothing you could do. Um, no antibiotics, no steroids, no ventilators, nothing like that. Women got bed fever, lost their babies regularly. You'd have 10 children and 8 of them would die before the age of 5, 8 out of 10. Hard to imagine what suffering must have been like in those days. And people say, oh, well, they were pretty tough, so they could take it. That sounds pretty cruel, and I don't think that's, how can anyone take the death of 8 children, 8 of your children dying out of 10 children? How can you take that? It's terrifying, and the amount of suffering, and then there was a threat of war, 100 Years' War, famine, crop failure, and even witchcraft, even the evil eye cast on you and made life even worse than it was. So life pretty grim, and the average age was 40 years old, and much less for women, of course. And yet, despite all this horror, uh, the average peasant, or indeed the laity of the Cathars, like everybody else, would have ambitions. Admittedly, not quite the same ambitions as we have. We want to go to Mallorca or to Miami, but they perhaps wanted to just be able to get a bit drunk on Lunasa or All Saints Day or whatever. They certainly wanted. Certainly, a man would want a wife and children, and his own little plot to grow vegetables and have pigs and chickens. Um, but even it seemed even for that ambition, you were punished. And it's all very well saying, well, it's a sin of Adam, but you sort of think, you might have thought to yourself, well, how can the sin of Adam account for all this horror? Why would we still being punished? What sort of God, a loving God, can possibly punish all these, or punish us all these generations after Adam, and we're still being punished like this, and punished for having ambitions, punished for, I don't know, for having natural appetites. We want to have a full belly. We want to drink some beer. Well, of course, the water in those days was impossible to drink. You had to drink diluted beer at the very least, but maybe at festivals you drink undiluted beer just to get a little drunk. And I want to get married, and when you get married, you have sex and you have babies. I want that, and women would want to have babies and want to be married. You might even have the ambition of sending your one of your sons off for his apprenticeship, so they become a wheelwright, have a skill, something to sell. And in the face of all this, you think, what kind of loving God can punish us so much just for the sin of Adam? And it doesn't seem possible, really. It doesn't seem like it could happen, And then, of course, when war came and famine came, it was just even worse. And then, of course, for being a Cathar, of course, there was a crusade against you and an inquisition against you. And the funny thing about fear and despair, in Pilgrim's Progress, despair is one of the great sources of temptation, because when we're in despair, it's then we begin to rip people off and cheat people and steal from people and generally behave badly towards other people because we want to survive so very, very much. And we begin to you'd sell a bag of bad meal to your neighbour, but just because, why not? You wanted to get a little bit of a cutting edge, a little bit of advantage, so that you could survive for a little bit longer. So that's what people do when they're in fear and despair. In order to survive for that little bit longer, you will do your neighbour harm, or do your neighbour down, or gossip against your neighbour, or bear false witness, or whatever. But then, as the laity of the Cathars, you look at the holy men and holy women of the clergy. And for a start, they didn't have sex. So obviously, they weren't going to have children, so there wasn't going to be bed fever and child death for them. But that's sort of neither here nor there, really. They would contemplate, they would pray, or they would pray for the community and for individuals, perhaps give the last rites. They were always there. They didn't eat much. They didn't have ambitions apart from the spiritual life, and to attain enlightenment through the spirit, through contemplation and prayer. Fantastic, almost, how can I put this? Such a contrast, really, between the life of a holy person and the life of a peasant or even an aristocrat. Just because, almost, it probably seemed, because you were looking at the spiritual rather than the physical, rather than the material, it meant that perhaps you weren't affected by all the horrible things that would happen to people that did want all the things that ordinary people do, like love and sex and children and property, and, well, not property, because you can own much property if you're a peasant, but your own pigs and chickens or whatever. And your chickens would get, some kind of fungal growth, and the pigs would get ill or whatever. But here we are, the sort of the person in the robes of the perfected one, in the robes of the clergy, would just sit there and meditate in the world, but not of the world. So not suffering in the same way, perhaps, as you, the laity, were suffering. Somehow, some sort of a kind of a sense of aloofness from the world, and yet praying for the world, and praying and using spiritual power, or the power of prayer. And sometimes miracles would probably arise, in the village, just to remind you that, God has not forsaken you. And the very presence of the clergy, perhaps, would be a clergy, pure clergy, not clergy that were taking money, for prayers and stuff like that, for indulgences and all that, but real clergy, being perfect, being spiritually minded, and sort of standing there as a beacon of spiritual beauty in the midst of the horror of ordinary life for peasants, and all the fear and despair that accompanied life in the 12th century. Beautiful, psychologically an incredible social arrangement, if you like. And I suppose in Hinduism, you'd have the sannyasin, and they would just be begging on the street, and you'd be there with all your ambitions and lusts and passions and and fears and sort of ideas that it's not fair. Why do bad things happen to me all the time? But not to my neighbour. Of course, you forget that bad things happen to everybody in the village, but it seems like only you are singled out for the really bad stuff. And how can that be? How can that be fair, or how can that be right or just? But you look at the holy people in your community, and it's like they sort of transcend these questions, if you like. They transcend all emotional reactions to the bad stuff and the ambitious stuff that is part of your ordinary life. It's like as if the clergy, the perfected ones of the Cathars, they stood apart, from the world itself somehow. And whereas you at the laity can't help but be of the world. You're of the clay. You're of the land. Like the birds and the bees. You want to reproduce. But here you are, these human beings. These holy people, standing apart from all the things standing apart from the animal kingdom, from the vegetable kingdom even, and somehow occupying a different bracket, a different category of human being, and that category is so unafraid and so undespairing. They have seen the light of God. They have seen heaven's doors open during their contemplation. They have had the gnosis, and they are full of light. In the midst of darkness, in the midst of death, there is this conviction of eternal life, and eternal love, and unconditional love for God, from God to his people, to his congregation, which basically the devil, the Lord of this world, cannot separate us from. And here we have, a group of people, the perfected ones, who are, living a pure life, which, as I say, represents a transcendent quality, which sets them apart from all the everyday suffering. And the thing about for today, in a way, we have this today. We're all ordinary people. We get drunk, we get high, we fornicate, we go on holiday, we overspend. We have worries, and we worry about what the neighbours think of us. We want our children to do well. We have mortgages to service. We have jobs to go to. We have cars to worry about, and cars to MOT and tax, and we're living this crazy life. But do we have any perfected ones? Do we have any holy people who are just sitting and meditating under a tree, and who are standing apart from all the insanity of modernist life? I don't. Perhaps we do. Well, there are not many of them, but I think if those that are there, and that those that we can see, and those that we have seen before, like Mother Teresa, I suppose, and and some other saints, we can see that they are apart, because to a very great extent, it's our passions and our lusts and our ambitions that seem to get us into trouble, if you like. Or to put it another way, we are punished for having the most basic of ambitions. But nowadays, of course, we have great ambitions. We want our kids to be richer than us. We want our houses to go up in value. We want to have a modern life forever. And we can't understand when there's a disease comes along for which there is no cure. There must be a cure, right? There must be. But even the vaccine to the coronavirus is only going to be preventative. If you get viral pneumonia and you've got underlying immune deficiencies and medical problems, you might not survive. And I think a lot of people, have got this idea, of course we're going to survive, because we're modern people. We don't die like people did in the 12th century, right? Often people are surprised when their baby dies. This is a modern world, babies don't die. Well, of course they do die. it's possible for a baby to die of anything, and through no fault of your own. And still people get crippled with polio, and still people get born with genetic diseases of one sort or another, and as MS and as cancer, of course, still. Perhaps there's a few more diseases that you wouldn't have had in the 12th century because people didn't live that long, or long enough to see, more cancer cases or whatever. That may be so, but people probably still got cancer in those days. They probably didn't even know it was cancer. In fact, a lot of, even right up to, I don't know, 19th century and beyond, people, they didn't put cancer, they just put withering disease and or things like that. They didn't really know what you died of, really. But again, we, in nowadays, it's a kind of a shame that we've got no perfected ones to look at. We've got no perfected clergy to look. And that's one of the things about priests. Catholic priests, if they are allowed to get married, which you probably will, in a sense, you can see why they've hung on to the idea of celibate priests for so long, because it's like, well, at least they don't have to worry about about families, because they don't have sex, they don't have families ostensibly, so they don't have quite the same ambitions as you or I have, and that makes them stand apart from all the potential suffering that you and I are prone to have with having families and children, and children that are beyond our control and all this. They don't have any of that. So, but now the Catholic priests don't even wear the cassock. They look like ordinary people now. They just go around in cars. They don't even wear dog collars, most of them either. So there's nobody to kind of stand apart. You can't see a person in a white robe walking down the street and say, that person has enlightenment, or that person has a spiritual life. And even if I don't have a spiritual life, I can admire the spiritual life of another person. And I think, we can feel good about ourselves spiritually by observing the spiritual life, of a holy person, or a clergyman, or a perfected one, to reference to the Cathars again. So perhaps that's what we're missing nowadays. We have no people in cassocks. We have no people walking among us, who are morally superior to us, as it were, and who are not prone to the same passions and ambitions as we are. Which many of them account for the suffering that we actually have nowadays as well. But I mean, at least we life is, in the West at least, better than it is in the 12th century. It was in the 12th century, there's no doubt about that. But I know a lot in the developing world, of course, life is pretty terrible for millions of people around the world. But again, they would probably look at the Christian ministry, Christian missionaries, and say, well, they're Christian. I mean, they've got this sort of extra dollop of grace, which we can look at and draw inspiration from. That's really what my point is for this presentation. And so I think, for me, even today, I think about the Cathars, and their clergy, their perfected ones, and I sort of, I draw inspiration from the perfected ones, actually. And I mean, I certainly was wanting to be a celibate priest for many years, But then I did get married, because, as Paul says, it's better to get married than to burn, and I was burning, so I did decide to get married in the end. But I don't have any children of my own anyway. I have stepchildren. It's true, but I do draw great inspiration. It's like all the sannyasin, it's because they're in this world, but they're not of it. Not like me. I'm so of this world, and I want things, and if I don't get things, I get resentful. And that's before I get ill or anything like that, or before I'm aging. And I mean, a lot of people in America that don't want to be aging. There's a lot of people in America got this thing about, I don't want to be old, But if you consider a monk, an old monk with a beard or whatever, it's like, well, he's not afraid of old age. You know what I mean? He's not afraid of death. He's not afraid of cancer. He's not afraid of famine or war or anything like that. He just stares death in the face, and smiles at death. Whereas I scream and cry and feel anxious and frightened and resentful and all the rest of it, and start to be nasty to other people. They retain a sort of ethical base to their life, despite all the horrible things that go on in this world. And that's what's sort of so inspiring about having holy people, monks and sannyasin and perfected ones. I honour the perfected ones of the Cathars. I really do, and I even honour the Catholic priests that are celibate, and those priests from the Orthodox Church that choose to remain celibate, which a lot of them do. They have a different way of looking at life altogether, which I think means that they can stare at death and misfortune and suffering right in the face, right in the eyes, and not have all the emotional reactions that I have, for example. I honour the perfected ones of the Cathars, and I draw inspiration from their lives.